Great, so as billed, I'm going to pick up on the tax increase on the self-employed and dividend taxes. Before I walk you through some of the nitty-gritty of what happened yesterday, I think it's worth remembering some of the context that the Chancellor faced. And in particular, we know that one of the most rapid changes in the labour market recently has been this rapid growth in individuals running their own businesses. So in particular, the number of people who are either self-employed or company owner managers have accounted for 40% of the growth in the workforce since 2008. So as the Chancellor pointed out, these groups have been an important part of the kind of good news employment story since the recession. But these growing numbers of these individuals have actually thrown up sort of three big issues, all of which are fundamentally related to the tax system and the fact that we tax employees at a higher rate than either the self-employed or company owner managers. So the first issue, which you've already heard something about, is the public finance implication of this. So in particular, because we give lower tax to these groups, we get lower revenue from them. HMRC estimates that this year alone, we'll get about £5 billion less revenue from the self-employed than we would if we gave them the same NICS treatment as employees, and about £6 billion less because we give lower taxes to company owner managers. And of course, as these groups grow, we'd expect those revenue losses to be increasing. So clearly there's a public finances issue here. But even if we ignored the revenue implications and were relaxed about those, there are also other important reasons to be worried about the tax differences. In particular, they raise issues around fairness, in particular concerns about similar individuals with very similar incomes getting very different tax outcomes, and about economic efficiency. So we've seen lots of headline stories about individuals who are changing their legal forms or who employers are changing legal forms for tax reasons. And we don't want the tax system distorting individuals' choices in that way. So to give you some sense of these tax differences that everyone's talking about, I'm going to just show you an example to walk you through how the tax system works. This is going to be an example of a job that generates £40,000 of income. I'm going to show you the tax implications of that for the coming tax year. So if the job is being done by an employee, there's going to be income tax and employee and employer NICS associated with that job, and the total tax burden will be £12,146. If instead the same job is done by a self-employed person, the tax is just £8,713. That entire difference is driven by national insurance contributions. So as you can see, I've put the marginal rates in brackets. The self-employed have a lower main rate of NICS compared to employees, so 9% rather than 12%. And there's no equivalent of employer NICS, which is at 13.8%. If you're a company owner manager, you can take dividends out of your company rather than salary. And for this example, your tax bill would just be £7,358. So you can see these are really pretty big tax differences for the equivalent job, according to legal form. So this is the kind of underlying concern that's in the tax system. I should also note that the graph I've just showed you is an example. There are actually various other ways that individuals running their own businesses can reduce their tax bills. Here are some examples. It includes splitting your income with a spouse. You have more scope to deduct work-related expenses from your income. That reduces your tax bill. There's more scope for tax evasion or tax avoidance. And if you're running your own company, you can retain incomes in your company, pay it out at a later date, and often access lower tax rates as a result. So there really are a whole range of tax benefits to running your own business. So what happened yesterday? So the policy was that we were going to increase the main rate, which is called Class 4, of national insurance contributions for the self-employed. So currently the way NICS works is you can earn a certain amount before you pay any NICS, and then after that the main rate of 9% kicks in. The policy is to reduce that main rate to 10% in next April and to 11% in April 2019. That raises the government about £600 million. It's worth noting that above something called the upper profits limit, the tax rate on self-employed NICS is 2%, and that remains unchanged. So there's also another change coming in April 2018, which the Chancellor highlighted yesterday, which is the abolition of something called Class 2 NICS. This was announced in Budget 2016 and is already due to come in April next year. Class 2 NICS is a flat rate of national insurance contributions. It will be £2.85 in the coming tax year that all self-employed people pay. That's being abolished, and that costs the government about £400 million. So to show you the effect of these two measures taken together, I'm going to show you the national insurance contribution schedule for the self-employed. And in particular, the blue line here is the actual schedule that will be in place from April this year. The green schedule is the schedule imagining that the 2 percentage point on the rate and the abolition of Class 2 NICs are both implemented in that year. So what you can see is that at the bottom, there are some individuals who don't pay any national insurance contributions. For those up to about £16,000 who are paying some national insurance contributions, some of those are getting a tax cut, so from the blue to the green. And the Chancellor has said that about 60% of the self-employed are in this range where they're either getting no change or a slight cut. Above that, bills will be going up. The maximum increase is £589. It's also worth noting that those individuals right at the top, even if their marginal rates are not changing, are still facing this £589 loss. So that's one way of seeing who's going to possibly win and lose from this reform. Another way is a classic IFS decile chart. So this is showing you the income deciles for the UK, and each group, each decile, it's showing the average gain or loss among households with some positive self-employment income. It's showing you for the two measures. The black line shows you together. The big takeaway here is that at the bottom of the distribution there are some small gains, but really the revenue raised from these policies overall, is really coming from the top half of the income distribution. So one thing the Chancellor mentioned yesterday was the link between self-employed NICs and benefits. Historically, there's thought to have been a link between how much you paid in NICs and the benefits you got. In fact, the thing to know now is that the self-employed get very similar benefits to employees. So in particular, the big difference in state benefits used to be the pension, but from April last year, both self-employed people and employees accrue the same rights to the same single-tier pension. So there's no longer any differences. In fact, there are only two differences in state benefits they get. One is contribution-based job seekers allowance, and the other is statutory paternal benefits. These are actually quite small in revenue terms, and they're far, far smaller than the really quite substantial NICs advantage that are currently given to the self-employed. Now, the Chancellor mentioned yesterday that he plans in the summer, alongside Matthew Taylor's review, to consult on possibly increasing parental benefits for the self-employed, which, if they can find a practical way to do it, would be a good move. Now, something else I just want to mention here. What I've discussed so far has been publicly funded state benefits. Really importantly, that is very different to employment rights. Employment rights and any differences between self-employed and employees do not justify lower tax rates. The important thing to notice is that unlike state benefits, where the government is basically giving a benefit to a group, employment rights are not like that. Employment rights are not the government giving employees a benefit. They are simply employers having to transfer benefits to their employees. Now, if that sounds kind of abstract to you, let's think of the following thought experiment, if you like. If you follow some of the arguments that are going around in the media, you'd think that, well, the self-employed get lower employment rights, they should get lower taxes. Conversely, employees get higher employment rights, they should pay higher taxes. So let's just suppose that the government announced tomorrow that every employer needs to give their employees 50 days of paid holiday. Great, you might think. Let's get packing. However, just think through what that means. If you follow the previous argument, it means that we've just said you need to have more holiday rights, but now you should increase the taxes of employees. Well, that means it's now less attractive for employers to employ me, and it's less attractive for me to be an employee. So that makes no sense. Think of it another way. If IFS has to give me 50 days of holiday pay, I suspect my wages aren't going to be the same as they would otherwise have been. They might not adjust overnight, but going forward, I suspect they'd be reduced to reflect the fact that IFS now has to give me more holiday pay. This just comes back to the point that they're not a benefit that the government is giving employees. They're just a transfer between employees and employers. And because there's no transfer from the government, there's nothing for the tax system to offset. So, no lower rates related to employment rights. Moving on. The other change we heard about yesterday was changes to dividend taxes. Again, I'll give you a little bit of context for the change. We actually already had some changes to dividends fairly recently. So in summer budget 2015, there was a new allowance for dividends of £5,000, which came into place last April, alongside an increase in marginal dividend tax rates of 7.5 percentage points for everyone. Now, there were some different winners and losers to this policy, but overall that was a tax rise of about £2 billion. As you've already heard from both Paul and Tom, that gave people a pretty strong incentive to bring dividends forward. We already have plenty of evidence that individuals adjust their behaviour according to the tax system. And yesterday, the OBR gave us some nice new figures to show that, yes, they do this. So overall, individuals who in 2015 knew that they faced a higher tax rate this year, they brought their dividends forward, overall they paid £800 million less in tax. And here's a surprising thing. HMRC estimate that of that £800 million kind of gain to the taxpayer, 1/7 of that went to just 100 individuals who on average withdrew £30 million of dividends each from their companies. That is definitely a response to the tax system. Back to what happened yesterday, we found out that now the dividend allowance that had just come into place is going to be reduced from £5,000 to £2,000 from April next year. That will raise the government about £825 million. What that really means is that there'll be a tax rise if your dividend income is above £2,000 and your total income is above £13,500. Now, in thinking about exactly who loses and how much they lose is actually pretty tricky. And that's because it depends not only on how much dividend income you have, but on your total income, including non-dividend income. But to give you a sense of magnitude, I'm going to show you one particular example. For an individual that has dividends of over £5,000 and a total income of over £16,500, these are the losses, the tax increases. So if your total non-dividend income is relatively low, so basically if you're a basic rate taxpayer, your loss is about £225. If your non-dividend income is higher, if you're an additional rate payer, your loss goes up to about £1,143. Now, there's a really important thing about this chart, which sounds like a subtle difference, but it really matters. This axis is non-dividend income. So imagine a company owner manager who earns, say, £200,000 overall, but who does the sort of tax-savvy thing and takes income out of their company for a small salary and lots of dividends. They're going to be on the left-hand side of this chart. So they're getting a loss of like £225. Imagine somebody else who maybe holds shares in a third-party company with an income of, say, £50,000. They're going to get a tax rise of £975. Basically, it really matters how your income is taken between dividends and non-dividend income. So now I'm going to take these two changes, the self-employed NICs and the dividend change together. I'm going to go back to showing you the graph I started with, which is on the left here, and I'm now showing you what that looks like with these new changes. So if you squint, you can probably see that the two far bars have edged up a little bit. There is now less of an incentive to move out of employment into either self-employment or owner management. But clearly, if you step back, you can see that the incentive is still there. So it's kind of nudging up, but not all the way. The big elephant in the room clearly is still employer NICs, which is really what's driving a wedge between these groups. But the tax change yesterday, despite being small, does change some incentives. I've just mentioned these ones. It also increases the incentive for owner managers to take income out of their companies in capital gains rather than dividends. It's a tax rise, which means it does reduce incentives to work and invest. And importantly, we should remember that the dividend tax change doesn't just apply to company owner managers, it also applies to people holding dividends holding shares in other people's companies. So yesterday's move reduces the incentive to save in shares outside of pensions and ISAs. So just stepping back, what do we think about these changes? Well, I think the big picture is that we're moving towards alignment, and that's a step in the right direction. Kind of the headline from the Green Budget chapter that we wrote recently, which does all of this in much more detail, was that differences in the tax rates across legal forms are costly, inefficient and unfair. As I told you at detail, they're not justified by differences in state benefits or employment rights, and they're a poor way to encourage entrepreneurship. As Paul mentioned at the start, what we'd really like to see is kind of a big picture solution for what is actually a really tricky part of the tax system. This is a small step towards what will be part of that solution, which is aligning rates so that a marginal pound was taxed in the same way regardless of your organisational form. But, and there are a couple of buts to bear in mind, like I just said, it is a tax rise, so this particular measure on its own has disadvantages to do with work incentives. And we really mustn't forget the tax base. So part of a big picture proper solution would also adjust the tax base so that we don't distort investment choices. So there's still a lot more to do in this area. Finally, a very quick word on business rates, just because they've been in the news so much. As you probably already all know, there's a business rates revaluation coming in April this year. That's not an overall tax rise, it's just a redistribution of the taxes across the country, but it affects different parts of the country quite differently. This is just a chart from a recent IFS report showing you that. You can see the biggest losses, the biggest increase in bills on average are in London. There's also lots of variation around these averages. So some businesses are seeing really much bigger or much smaller changes in their bills. Now, the government already runs a programme of transitional relief to sort of minimise the impact of big overnight changes. Yesterday, there was some small extra amounts of money to ease that transition by some more. I've put up the 3 measures here. I won't walk you through them. So the takeaway is small amounts of money, but very well targeted, so that actually some individual businesses will see fairly sizable changes to their tax bill. So a quick summary from me. The changes yesterday were the 2 percentage point increase in the main rate of self-employed NICs, a reduction in dividend tax allowance. Both of those measures are the ones that raise the government some money. And then some small costs associated with some business rates relief. Taken together, I'd say this amounts to a fairly small change to our tax system, albeit ones that have large impact on some people, and that's probably a good thing. It would be great if in future this sort of marked the start of moving towards budgets that weren't constantly tinkering with the tax system.